So in person, Festerson is here in red. Sorry. Key is not here, Boggs is not here, Bonner is not here, Clay is not here, Dawson is not here, Ellis is not here, Castro is not here, Green is not here, Harrison is not here. Vincent is here in red. James is not here. King is not here. Lewis is not here. Linda Q is not here. Morrison is not here. Grace is not here. Ward is not here. Wilcox is not here. Wilder is not here. And Parks is not here. Quickly see who's online. Let's see. King is online. Wilder is online. Linda Q is online. Bonner is online. James is online. And Wilcox is online. As of now, that's everybody. Hey, looks like somebody was doing the Hardy-Weinberg up here. But actually really doing it using the, algebraically. This is the kind of stuff you would do if you were in 120, which is the biology majors version of this course. They actually solve for solve for different variables, which I actually found fun, but I know most people don't think that's fun. Harrison is now online. How about you, Kesterson? You going anywhere for the week?
No. My girlfriend's having surgery today, and she'll probably be laid up for a week. We're going to a church on Thanksgiving Day to have Thanksgiving dinner,
Okay,
so we won't have to mess up the house.
good thinking. We're going to my in-laws.
Good thinking.
Yeah. All right, so it is 8. We'll get started. Everybody's accounted for as far as attendance is concerned. You guys know how to do attendance. The first word for attendance today will be cranberry, since today is National Cranberry Relish Day. Which brings me to an idea for you, / reminder. So again, you need to start turning in independent work. So one good idea, I think, for independent work, whether, again, you just answer the question or write a paper about it. Think about Thanksgiving dinner. So, you can answer, where are turkeys originally from? Where are cranberries originally from? Where are pumpkins originally from? Corn, whatever it is that you like your family eats for Thanksgiving. If you want to, one item at a time, one dish at a time, look it up and just send me an email. I looked it up, and according to this source, cranberries are from blah, 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 right? And then again, you can ask all kinds of questions about those things, like what's the scientific name of all these things? Where were they domesticated, right? So, for example, I don't want to say it, I want to give it away. Potatoes are from one place, but they were domesticated elsewhere, at least the way potatoes as we know it. So things like that. And again, you could look up, like, what's their scientific name, and not just their genus, species, but you could, if you want to, look up their whole entire classification. So again, 1 point each for doing that. And again, if you wanted to get more points, technically, you could write papers about it. But again, just to remind you, if you write papers, make sure you do it in your own words. Make sure you don't copy your source. If you do copy your source, just use quotation marks. That's it. Any questions about independent work? Really quickly, since this is our last meeting until we get back from fall break, I plan on doing some work over the weekend, so if you need me, let me know. Some of you really need to get caught up, and I'm here to help you, if I can. Now, my kids also have the week off of school, so it'll be hectic in my house, but I promise you I'll try my best to be there if you need me. I guess that's it. Lab, that's right. Lab is due today, technically. So make sure you get that lab done. And again, if you need me, let me know. I can help. Any questions about stuff in general? Then let's jump into it. Let's go back talking about what we were talking about on Wednesday. Back it up a step. We were talking about population growth models. And there's two different population growth models that you need to know the difference between. One of them we completely finished talking about, and that was called exponential growth. And that's when a population basically just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows and doesn't stop, right? Because it's in an ideal, unlimited environment. So there's nothing slowing that population growth down. They just keep on, I don't want to say doubling, because sometimes it's double, sometimes it's half than double, sometimes it's more than double. But every generation after generation is growing by a constant factor. Then we started getting into this second population growth model, which is called logistic population growth model. And when I introduced you to this on Wednesday, I mentioned that this whole idea of an unlimited ideal environment is almost an academic one, because technically there's no such thing as a truly unlimited environment. So in most cases, things are not growing exponentially, or as you're about to see in a few slides, things do often start off growing exponentially, but then because things are not unlimited, then things start slowing it down. And you'll see that'll make a lot more sense when I show you the graph. And what are these things that are making it slow down? Those things are called limiting factors, and that's the last thing we talked about. Limiting factors are those things that affect the population growth rate, whether it means well, in this case, it's limiting, so it's decreasing the population growth. Let me give you one good example for that, because this is an argument a lot of people make about climate change. So plants grow, right? We know what plants need to grow. At the very least, we know they need carbon dioxide so they can do photosynthesis, right? They need water so they can do photosynthesis. They need light so they can do photosynthesis. And they need oxygen so they can do respiration, right? And there's other things too, as you're going to learn a lot more about in the next chapter. They need things like nitrogen and phosphorus. So they need a lot of things to grow, including, like I already said, they need carbon dioxide, right? But, actually, you know what? I don't want to talk about it. I'll come back to that conversation. That is a limiting factor, but I don't want to talk about that in this context yet. I might confuse things, so we'll talk about that later. Anyway, I guess for the exam, what you need to know is a limiting factor is one of these things that basically influence the population growth rate. So any questions about that? I might give you some examples. I mean, I definitely will give you some examples of some limiting factors, but I don't remember if it's more so in this chapter or the next one. But yeah, here we go. That brings us to some other terms you need to be very familiar with. We're going to talk about it in this chapter. We're going to talk about it in the next chapter too. The first one is the carrying capacity. You need to know the definition of this. Not verbatim, right? Because whenever I ask a definition, it's usually not verbatim. Because I want you to understand the words, not just memorize them. Carrying capacity is the maximum population size that a particular environment can sustain. So for any given population in any given area, there is a carrying capacity. And in nature, usually things are already at carrying capacity. Like if you were to go to Kanawha State Forest and count the number of oak trees, let's get specific and say that the number of red oak trees, probably that's as many as there can be, right? So it hits a certain population size and it stays there. Why? Because there's limiting factors, right? So using the same example, these trees need space, right? Because they need sun, they need water, they need dirt. And if you've been to the Kanawha State Forest, again, just using the same example, you can see, like generally speaking, other than a place where people have cut down trees, but in the actual forest, it's all taken, right? All the real estate is taken, so to speak. So, and again, that's just one example. But yes, you definitely need to understand what carrying capacity is. That's the largest, basically, it's the highest the population can get naturally. Of course, with humans, and we'll talk about this more later in this chapter, but humans kind of change things. Like so far, humans haven't hit our carrying capacity because we keep increasing it, right? So what are the things that organisms need, including humans? They need food, they need water, they need shelter, right? And humans keep coming out with more ways to increase the amount of food we have and increase the number of shelters we have, right? So because of that, We haven't hit carrying capacity, which is good topic for independent work if you want. There are some people who have estimated what our carrying capacity is, so you can look that up. What do they hypothesize that the human carrying capacity is? As far as I know, there is no consensus yet, so when you look it up, you might find a number of different answers. So again, for one point, you can just send me an email saying, I looked it up and according to this source, this is what they hypothesize. Or if you want, you can write a paper about it. Go to Google Docs. Say, according to this source, this is the carrying capacity. However, this source says it's this, right? And you can write a paper about it. Anyway, does anybody have any questions about what carrying capacity is? All right, so finally, we get to what I'm trying to get at. Remember, we're talking about population growth models. There was two of them that you needed to know, exponential growth and logistic growth. And finally, I've given you enough background information to say what logistic growth is. And logistic growth is when the population growth rate decreases as the population size approaches carrying capacity. And again, well, not again, but when the population finally does hit carrying capacity, the growth rate is 0. And this will make a lot more sense when I show you the slide. Matter of fact, I'm not even going to ask if you have questions yet. Let me show you the next slide. Then I'll ask if you have questions about the second bullet point of logistic growth. So here we go. This is a great example. Now, look, if you were to look, let's see, and we're looking at years, up until, no, not there. I'm going to say, right, I wish I could draw a straight line. Up until like right after 1925, that was exponential growth, right? We're looking at these, this is a real example of breeding male fur seals. These are some seals on an island, right? And an island, a small rock island, and obviously you're going to run out of real estate on a small rock island. So the population grew and it grew and it grew. And as it started reaching carrying capacity, right there where I drew that horrible line right here, at that point, you can see the population starts slowing down. The growth rate starts slower, until finally it hits 0. So that's that's logistic growth. Again, and your book doesn't focus on this, but I think I like to focus on it. It starts off exponential. But then it hits that point where you start hitting those limiting factors. You start running out of resources. And then again, population starts slowing and hitting 0. Now, as far as the exam is concerned, what I'm about to say is not important. But since I brought it up earlier, I'm going to bring it up now. Like I said, the human population, we don't even know what our carrying capacity is. We haven't hit it. And we are still in exponential growth. We didn't used to be, and that'll be a topic in the next chapter. But it used to be kind of like we were at carrying capacity, but then things changed. And now we're currently at exponential growth. But one could argue that we are starting to slow down. And the interesting thing about this, the thing I love about it is, it's not because we're necessarily running out of resources or hitting those limiting factors. For humans, it's because we've realized that we don't want to hit carrying capacity. It's not good. Carrying capacity is a struggle to survive, right? At that point, your population is not growing anymore, you're fighting for resources. So humans have figured it out and said, all right, well, maybe we shouldn't be having so many kids. Maybe we shouldn't have so many children. So that's what's currently happening. So our population growth rate is starting to slow, but it's not necessarily because we're coming close to carrying capacity. It's because we are in control. Well, we have some control over our destiny as a species. And this goes back to something Kesterson asked on Wednesday when you asked something about people having a bunch of kids, how they used to have a bunch of kids, right? And they don't anymore, generally speaking. And this has something to do with that. But again, we'll get into that later in the chapter, but there's a little preview for you. I do want to point one more thing out. That red line is the model, right? It's a prediction almost. But you can see what we have here, these little black dots. Those are the actual data, right? So this is the model, what we would expect to see, that red line. But the actual data you see doesn't necessarily fall always on the line, especially when we get here to carrying capacity. Sometimes it goes way above carrying capacity, but then obviously they're running out of resources, so things die. So then it dips down below carrying capacity and it comes back up. The point I'm trying to make here, and it's not important for the exam, but it is important for understanding things. These are just models, right? So things don't always perfectly fit the model, but they do generally fit the model. Does that make sense? None of this is exact. This is just models. This is what we predict based on, population ecology. So any questions about that slide or logistic growth in general? Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about logistic growth, but anything so far? I put an X through here. This should be obvious at this point in the semester, but obviously I'm not going to ask you any questions about breeding male fur seals. And if I did, the only question would be like me giving you this graph and asking you to decipher it. Matter of fact, I should probably start doing that more in the exams. More pictures or questions where I ask you to decipher data, because that's probably the more important thing you're going to learn in this class. Like,
Yeah.
for example, when we have the midterm elections next year, people start saying this thing about the crime rate, that thing about the economy, whatever side you're on, I don't care, but it'll be good to be able to decipher a graph and figure out what the data means.
That's what we do in statistics is.
Oh, yeah.
He says that'll carry on in your business career.
Yep.
That's a scatter plot.
Yep. Sure is. All right, any other questions or any questions about the slide one last time? All right, the next word for attendance, it's gonna be turkey. I'm getting hyped up for Thanksgiving. Turkey. And again, just to remind you that what I've already told you, it's a good independent work topic. What is the scientific name of a turkey, for 1 point? Where are turkeys originally from, for 1 point? And side note, this has nothing to do with biology, but I was listening to Bob and Tom the other day, and they were talking about turkeys in other countries. And I didn't even think about that, because, they don't, other than Canada, they don't really do Thanksgiving. So they probably don't eat turkeys like we do. And now that I think about it, and I've been to a few countries, and I didn't see any turkeys there, like in the refrigerators, or in the grocery stores. But anyway, I got off on a tangent. So the next slide I'm going to show you is going to be a slide that compares the logistic growth model with the exponential growth model. Again, like I kind of pointed out with that last slide, with the difference between that red line and the dots, both of these are theoretical ideas of population growth, right? These are models. This is just what we predict based on what we know. But no natural population fits exponential growth or logistic growth perfectly, right? It's just a model. So here's the example. Actually, let me bring one more thing up, because I did put it in writing, and this is definitely going to be a test question. I'll remind you what I said earlier, or previously in the week. Exponential growth, one of the ways you can identify this, or one of the questions you're going to get about it on the exam, is this is a J-shaped curve for exponential growth. J-shaped curve. I did put that in writing. Apparently what I forgot to put in the writing earlier is that when you're talking about logistic growth, it's an S-shaped curve, right? So J-shaped for exponential, S-shaped curve for logistic. And again, one more time, you need to recognize carrying capacity. You need to know carrying capacity, right? And that's that point where a population reaches zero population growth, because that's as much as the environment can sustain, right? Again, using these seals as an example, I'm just assuming, since they're on that small island, their biggest limiting factor, there's all kinds of different limiting factors, right? They need food, water. In this case, not that it matters for the exam, but I'm just guessing the biggest limiting factor there was real estate, right? They're on that small rock island. They literally just ran out of places to live. Therefore, the population evens off. Because when they have more, the more seals are born, but when there's more than they can fit on the island, they're competing for resources, right? They're competing for a place to live. A lot of them fall into the water, probably get eaten by predators, right? So the more the population goes over carrying capacity, the more of them that are dying, right? Because they don't have a place to stay. And again, that's just one example. Anyway, that's the last discussion about exponential and logistic growth. We will come back to this idea of carrying capacity, though. But are there any last questions about exponential growth or logistic growth?
Is there an end to the exponential growth on the rabbit?
Oh yeah, there definitely is. That's what I was kind of hitting at earlier. Maybe in this time, whatever time frame this is, they haven't hit it yet. But in theory, nothing can do exponential growth forever. And this one might be a little bit harder one, but another independent work topic is if you can find some examples of maybe are there species out there that are currently, other than humans, experiencing exponential growth? And if so, again, does anybody have any hypotheses as to when they're going to start hitting logistic growth?
You look up in insects.
Yeah, insects might be a great, that is, yeah, that really is a good example. And there's a third type of population growth that I'm going to talk about later. And we don't use insects as an example on that one, but in a sense they are, because think about what happens with insects. Generally speaking, the population is just going to explode every year. It just explodes, right? It's an exponential growth. And I don't know this for sure. It probably depends on the species of the insect. But probably what happens is it's exponential, and then all of a sudden it's probably just boom, that's it. You know what I mean? Like, oh, it's too cold, or all the food's gone. So I assume for a lot of species of insects, it just goes up and then just goes away and crashes, as opposed to going up and staying up, right? Because things like insects, which is a great example, a lot of them, they live 1 year and die, right? They're born, they do the best they can, they reproduce, and then they die. So great example. And again, speaking of examples, so far I've given you an example of a rabbit and a seal. So another independent work topic for just 1 point, like just look up exponential growth. Like I looked it up, and of course, and this source uses blank as an example for exponential growth. This source uses blank as an example of logistic growth, because there's so many different examples out there. All right, so let's move on past exponential growth and logistic growth. And again, there is one more. It doesn't necessarily fall under. I don't know if I want to say that. Yeah, it does fall under. It is a third type of a population growth model. It kind of fits more like what Kestis and I were just talking about. Not perfectly fit what we were talking about, but kind of close, and you'll see what I mean. But before we can talk about that, let's go back to this idea of limiting factors, right? So I said there's things that keep that population eventually from going from exponential, right? There's things that make it switch from exponential to logistic. There's things that make it slow down to where it hits carrying capacity, right? And those things are called limiting factors. And now I'm telling you there's 2 different types of limiting factors. Well, in this conversation, there's 2 different types of limiting factors. There's density dependent and density independent. You're going to need to know the difference between them. I'm going to explain it. For the exam, I'll probably give you an example of like, all right, this thing happened to a population and this was the result. And then you have to recognize it as density dependent or density independent. And of course, you guys have seen my multiple choice exams, and you know almost always there's more than 2 choices. So for those questions, it's either going to be density dependent or density independent. Those other choices are nothing but garbage. And generally speaking, if you choose at least one of the 2, I don't want to say correct answers, but one of these 2 is going to be correct. All the other stuff is garbage. If you choose the garbage, you'll get 0 credit. And if you choose one that you were at least on the right track, you probably at least get partial credit. Anyway, let's talk about it. Density dependent factors, it's in the name. These are limiting factors, just like density independent factors. But it's limiting factors in which the intensity is related to the population density. Meaning the more dense it is, the more intense the factor is. So I'll underline this part. That's the part that's unique to density dependent factors.
Is density the number of members in the group population?
Yeah, not just the numbers, but the numbers in a given area. You know what I mean? Like, I think, does anybody know how many people live in New York? I don't.
Too many.
Yeah, I think it's one. I might as well ask. How many people live in New York City? Oof, never mind. That was a bad example. Good grief. That can't be right. Maybe it is 8 million. Anyway, imagine a city. That's huge. But even imagine a city that had 1.8 million people in it. Right, a city with 1.8 million people in it, and compare that to West Virginia, who has about 1.8 million people. Last time I checked. So imagine that's what I mean by density, right? In that city, you've got all the same people, this whole amount of West Virginia, the same number of people crammed into a city. That's population density, right? It's how many per area. So an obvious example of density-dependent factors is something called intra-specific competition. You also need to know that. I'm going to underline this prefix because that's the key there. So this is competition within the same species. So using the example I gave earlier when we were talking about those seals, that was intra-specific competition, at least the example I was giving, because I kept talking about real estate, right? Like they're on an island, they need space. Literally, they just need a place to exist. So they were competing for just a place to be. So that was intra-specific, right? Because they're competing against each other. And of course, here you see two wolves fighting over a carcass. They're competing over food. That is intra-specific. But again, population density affects these, right? So again, using those seals as an example, obviously you have a given island, right? However big it is, that is how big it is. So the more seals you have on it, the higher the population density. Therefore, the more they're competing for space. In this case, we have two wolves fighting over a carcass. So the population density there is 2 wolves per meter, square meter or something, right? But then if you add a third wolf, now they're fighting even more. Now they have even less food between the 3 of them. Now if you add a fourth wolf, now the 4 wolves are eating on that carcass. So now there's even less food per wolf, so on and so forth, right? So you can see with density dependent factors, the higher the population density, the more they're competing. Let me give you some more examples on the next slide before I take questions. Obviously, any limiting factor can do this. Lower birth rates and increased death rates, right? That's how they slow population growth. So yes, we're talking about density dependent factors right now as opposed to independent. But either way, any factor, whether it's dependent or independent, this is what they do. They lower birth rates and they increase death rates. Some examples, and again, you can question this for independent work and say, yep, I looked it up, and according to this source, they agree. This is a good example. Or you can expand on the information I'm giving you. So here's a list of examples I'm about to give you. You can look it up and find other examples of density-dependent factors for independent work. Anyway, some examples are accumulation of toxic waste products. That's I wouldn't usually think of that too much. But when you think about things like bacteria, everything produces waste products. We produce feces and urine and carbon dioxide, right? That's our waste product. But other things produce other stuff. And it can be toxic. And I'll just leave it at that. We can dive deeper, but this is a 100 level class. Disease transmission under crowded conditions. Once again, let's talk about pandemics in West Virginia versus that hypothetical city I was talking about, right? If a pandemic hits a city, a small city, like geographically small, that has 1.8 million people crammed in it, that disease is going to spread quickly. Meanwhile, if you in a state like West Virginia, and I don't know if you remember, but we were the last state, if I remember correctly, that didn't have a COVID case. Actually, I'm positive because I wrote a song about it, or I rewrote Country Roads about it. So again, it's a lot harder to spread a disease when people are farther apart, right? It's pretty simple. And of course, that's just a human example, but there's a lot, anything. The higher the population density, the easier it is to spread diseases. Food, obviously, America looked a lot different when, for example, when it was first colonized by Europeans. There was like fish everywhere and game everywhere, right? Like elk and deer and things like that. Now things aren't like that, right? Water, shelter. So basically, and again, this is just things that are density dependent. So any questions about density dependent factors? And again, I just want to point this out really quickly. These two right here, this is true. That's what density dependent factors can do, but also that's what density independent factors can also do. So that's not anything unique to density dependent. These are unique to density dependent. I'll give you another example. Let's say we go into World War III here, and let's say Russia lobs a nuclear bomb at us, and the nuclear bomb can kill everything within a 1 mile radius, right? 1 mile radius, it'll kill everything. That is the density independent factor. And I know I haven't talked about that completely yet because it doesn't, because regardless of how many people or how many things are in that 1 square mile, everything's going to be dead, right? It's not like if you put more people in there, then the intensity of the bomb's going to be higher. Anyway, any questions about density dependent factors? I'm going to give you one more example from the old textbook on the next slide, and then we'll move on to independent. All right. Next word for attendance. Actually, I know. The next word for attendance is your favorite Thanksgiving dish, so whatever it may be for you. And if you can't pick one, or if you really can't pick a favorite, just, I don't know, pick one for the sake of independent work. Attendance words. So anyway, this is a great example of density dependent factors, right? So what we have here, I'll explain these graphs. The mean number of offspring per female of this bird. So you can see here, this is how many offspring each bird usually has when it lays eggs. This is the population density of that population. So you can see here, when there's only like 10 birds per whatever, I don't know, whether it's per square meter, per square kilometer, I don't know what it is, doesn't matter. The point is, there's 10 in a given area. You can see they're having a lot more offspring. But as things get more crowded and more crowded and more crowded, they're having fewer and fewer offspring. Does that make sense? You can see that. And the reason being, well, there's a lot of reasons, but think about it. They need nests, right? They need places to keep their eggs safe and their chicks safe. So obviously, the less room they have to do that, the fewer offspring they're going to have. Right? Under these crowded conditions, right, the chicks are going to fall out of the nest. They're going to fall down to predation. Just an example. And I like this example too. So on this side, we have the proportional death rate. So this is, again, just the death rate, really low death rate, really high death rate. And here on the x-axis, we have kelp perch density. So what we're looking at here is the number of fish, right, this particular type of fish, per whatever, right, a number per plot, so I don't know, per cubic meter, doesn't matter. The point is, this means population density is increasing. So, and they live in this kelp, right? The higher the population gets, so also the higher the death rate gets. Just think about it. If they're hiding from predators in the kelp, then the more there are, the fewer hiding places there are. And the fewer hiding places there are, the more likely you are to be eaten. So again, this is just a great example of how density, let's see, let me back it up one step, how density or any limiting factor can lower birth rate and increase death rate, right? We can see here how the birth rate is being lowered due to population density. We can see here how the death rate is increasing due to density dependent factors. And once again, a big X saying you don't need to study that. There'll be no questions about that unless I were to give you that graph and ask you to decipher it. Any questions about that?
I got one question.
Yeah.
Why do fish stay in schools if the chances are them being attacked by predators is going to be greater?
Not all fish do that, but safety in numbers. So yeah, the school is going to get attacked, but the chances of one individual getting eaten is a lot lower. Like imagine, imagine there's like 5 fish and there's something trying to eat them. You have a 1 in 5 chance of surviving. But if there's 500 fish, you have a 1 in 500 chance of surviving. It's just safety numbers. Same with like zebras and gazelles and things like that. You see them out there prancing around in big herds, and that's why. So as a group, it's not safe. For that group, they might be better if they were by themselves, but once they're together, as an individual is safer in a larger group. Good question. And also really quick, I want to point this out because I don't remember if your textbook really reiterates this or not. But this is what I love, the beauty of this is how nature works. I love that nature just keeps things in check and in balance, right? Populations don't get too large because they can't. Once the larger population gets, generally speaking, the lower the birth rates get, depending on the species. Or the larger the population gets, the higher the death rates, right? Nature takes care of itself. Anyway, any questions about that side? Okay, that's it for density dependent factors. Let's talk about the opposite, which is density independent factors. Ooh, really quickly, sorry. So, complete side note, I just remembered, I want to remind you, next Wednesday, we are meeting in person and in person only. There's 2 people who can't make it because they will be not in town. So you guys get in touch with me, we'll figure something out for you. But for the rest of you, you have to be here to get your extra credit and to be counted as present. I will not be streaming, I will not be recording, so you have to be here. And then at the end of the class, you're gonna do some, do the student evaluations. Anyway, back to this, density independent factors. This is just the opposite of what we talked about earlier. This is where the intensity is unrelated to density, right? So again, a nuclear bomb. A nuclear bomb is going to kill everything. Just using the same example I did, they're all different sizes and power, different amounts of power. But the hypothetical bomb I'm talking about kills everything within 1 square mile. Right? It doesn't matter how many things are in there. It's just going to kill everything. Right? That would be density independent. What's another good example? Remember, it was a year or 2 ago, or maybe it was this year. Those fires in Hawaii it just kills everything in that area. For the most part, was killed due to the fire. Actually, that's a bad example, and I won't talk about why, because you could argue that's also density dependent. But yeah, we'll talk about that later. Anyway, some factors include changes in weather or climate. So again, if you have a good example of this is drought, right? We're going through a drought. Generally speaking, that killed a lot of plants, right? Doesn't matter if there was a lot of plants in that one area or if they were spread out. It's just going to kill everything, right? If it's just going to kill everything regardless. And some other good examples are floods, fires, storms, right? They're just deadly regardless of the intensity of a storm, for example, does not matter. It doesn't matter how many people live or things live in that given area that's hit by the storm, right? The storm its intensity is based on meteorological factors like pressure and wind and things like that, right? It doesn't matter population density, right? The density of a population does not affect the power of a storm. So anyway, any questions so far about density independent factors? Good. This next slide goes back to what Kesterson was asking earlier, what I was trying to explain. I knew I had a graph for this. So here we have these insects, exponential growth, and they don't level off, right? They just grow and grow and grow because everything's great. Also because they have a type 3 survivorship, right? That at equilibrium, the opposite of the equilibrium lifestyle, right? So they just explode, and then all of a sudden, nothing's good. Nothing's good for them anymore. So the population just crashes again until the next year. Anyway, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask any questions about that. But bringing all this together is this next slide. In the long term, right? Not just like this last one. That's looking at 1 year, right? But in the long term, populations are regulated by complex interactions of density dependent and density independent factors. So all those examples that I gave for density dependent, and I gave examples for density independent, in all actuality, it's not like they work separately, they all work together, right? All populations have to deal with both types of factors, density dependent and density independent. Oh, and again, going back to this, sorry, I got a little bit sidetracked again. Again, we're talking about density independent factors. So if it was density dependent factors here, I would have hypothesized that the population would grow and then start slowing and then stay there, right? If it was density dependent, like if they just ran out of food, right? If there's just like, all right, there's enough to feed this many people or this many insects, there's enough to feed this many insects, there's not enough to feed more than that, so it would even off, right? That would be a density dependent factor, right? Because it's dependent on how many insects there are. But something like climate, which is probably what happened here, right? They could survive it, but then it just gets too hot. So it doesn't matter how many insects there are per square mile or whatever. However many there are, it doesn't matter. They just died off, right? Because it was a density independent factor. It just killed everything. It doesn't matter if there was a lot or a little. For the most part, everything died. Or more specifically, probably what happened is they grew up, they ate, they had sex, they reproduced, they laid their eggs, and now they don't need to, they just die off. Anyway, So again, this whole idea of limiting factors, again, they work together on populations. Which brings us to the next topic, which is called population cycles. Population cycles. And in a sense, and again, look, we're still on this main bullet point right here, regulation of population growth. So, or excuse me, forget that. Let's even look at this bigger bullet point here. We're looking at population growth models. So we talked about exponential, we talked about logistic, and now we're going to talk about population cycles, which you could argue is a third type of a growth model. And you'll see what I mean once we get started. The common example, as a matter of fact, it's so common, I don't think I've ever seen another example of something called a boom and bust cycle. And you need to know what a boom and bust cycle is, so I'm going to explain it. Is the snowshoe and hares and their main predator, the lynx. This is the example I always see. If you want to look and find another example of a boom and bust cycle for our independent work, go for it. But what we're looking at here, this is just a great example of how things work together. Density-dependent factors, density-independent factors, and then also it's a good example of how sometimes you can have logistic growth versus exponential growth, and how sometimes we can have what we showed earlier with those insects where things just crash, right? So here we go. This is a great example. So this is not the logistic growth or exponential growth, right? What this looks like, and the way I would describe it, I don't think your textbook describes it like this, but in my description, I would say, well, yes, the proper term for this is boom and bust. But the way I would describe boom and bust cycles is exponential growth followed by a crash, followed by exponential growth, followed by a crash. You can see here, nothing ever evens off, right? So the snowshoe hare example, or for example, and I'll say this, as the lynx population falls, there's less things eating the snowshoe hare, so their population explodes. And then it gets to the point where there's just so few lynx, so this is density dependent factors, right? There's so few lynx and so many hares that the lynx aren't really even competing anymore, right? There's just like food everywhere. So because of that, their population starts to take off because they're eating all these hares. And then of course, once they're eating all those hares, their population starts to decline. And again, since the food source of the lynx is declining, their population declines too. And again, the point here is the boom and bust cycle is when, again, you have a exponential growth, and then it crashes, and then it goes again. And this is just a great example of all the things put together, right? This is why we get this weird graph, is because we have density-dependent and density-independent things working together. Anyway, once again, a big old X through here. That's just an example. Don't study that picture. There's nothing to memorize. Also, if I remember correctly, that picture is from the old textbook. So if you do want to look at it for some reason, you'll need to download the PowerPoint. Speaking of downloading the PowerPoint, if you do that, you can watch this little animation about population ecology. That brings us to the next main bullet point. Now that you're pretty well versed on population ecology, let's talk about applications of population ecology. Excuse me, for the most part, I'm done explaining how population growth works. I'm done explaining population ecology and how it works. Now we're learning about how to apply it. So natural ecosystems have been converted to those that produce goods and services for our benefits. This is just talking about, right, well, now we're talking about human interaction, right? How humans interact with the environment. We've changed natural ecosystems so they can benefit us. Think about the Midwest, right? That used to be prairie, a bunch of grassland. So we take it and get rid of the grass and grow stuff, right? We grow crops. That's just one example. So population ecology is used to increase the populations of organisms that we want to harvest. Again, using the same example I just used, maybe growing corn out in Iowa. That's just one example, right? We use population ecology to boost our yields of corn in that example. We use population ecology to decrease the population of pests. So again, using the same example of this corn farm in Iowa, they want to get rid of the things that are eating their corn, right? They want to get rid of those insects, maybe even birds, there might be, or even mammals eating their corn. So they want to decrease the population of those things. And then finally, population ecology is used to save populations of organisms that are threatened with extinction. Of course, the examples I've been given of the corn doesn't really fit well with that last bullet point. But that is the third application of population ecology. And that's probably the one people think about the most, I think. people who aren't in biology, because you hear about it all the time. Endangered species, critically endangered species, threatened species, species that have gone extinct. You hear about that a lot. So let's talk about that one first. Conservation of endangered species. I'm gonna give you an example. Speaking of this example, if you look at the list of videos that you can watch for extra credit, there's a great documentary about this. And I like it too because it brings together the military and biologists, which is what I did, prior military and then a biologist. But anyway, this is just an example. We have this particular woodpecker that requires longleaf pine forest, right? This is where it lives. It can't live anywhere else. This is probably why it's endangered, right? The pickier something is, usually the more in danger it is. Because anyway, this is where it lives, can't live anywhere else. It needs these particular pine trees. This is where they drill holes in the pine trees to make their nest, right? This is the only place they'll do it. So because of this, these woodpeckers, their numbers have been declining. Because as you can imagine, humans do things, right? We cut down trees to use for lumber. We cut down trees because we want to use that land to grow stuff. So this part makes sense, right? This should make sense. From here up should make sense. This is common sense stuff, right? We have these birds. These birds can only live in this type of tree. So when we cut those trees down, the numbers of the birds decline. But here's where it gets a little bit odd. This third bullet point. Can anybody, this is counterintuitive. These birds need to live in these forests to survive. And one of the things that's been killing off these birds is this third bullet point right here. Suppressing fires. So how would suppressing fires be a bad thing? Think about it. And this is what I love about this example. I don't remember if your textbook gives this example, but I know the old textbook did, and this is why I kept it. And I love this because everything's not common sense, right? Sometimes common sense actually hurts you. Because to me, common sense says, all right, these things need these trees, they need these forests to survive. So, there's a fire in this critical habitat, we better put it out and protect it. So any guesses as to why or how that third bullet point could result in the declining numbers of those particular woodpeckers? You're putting out fires. How's that a bad thing? Any guesses? I don't expect anybody to know, so I'm not going to wait too long. All right, let's talk about why. And again, this is just an example. And again, a great example because to me, this is counterintuitive. Putting out fires is a good thing. Not in this case. So breeding birds, right, when these particular woodpeckers are breeding, they will abandon their nest when the vegetation around it gets too high. So again, they're living in trees, right? But this is the forest, so there's other stuff growing too. So when the vegetation around it gets a bit higher than about 15 feet, these birds are just like, I'm not going to live here anymore. I'm going to abandon this nest. And the reason being, not that you need to know this, again, this is just an example. But the reason they abandon their nest when this happens is because they require a clear flight path between trees. They don't like to go over the brush or definitely don't like to fly through it, right? They need a clear flight path. So once stuff gets in their way, they're just like, all right, I'm leaving, I'm going somewhere else. So this critical habitat was protected when they started a maintenance program that included controlled fires to reduce to reduce the undergrowth. So here's an example. I'll show you a picture. That'll make a lot more sense. So this is what it looks like when we protect it from fires. But those fires were actually naturally occurring. So then we let nature do its thing. And this is what it looks like when you have the fires. And again, that brought back the population. I love that example because once again, this is why we have people who study population ecology, because sometimes common sense goes against what needs to be done, right? Common sense is like, oh my God, these things are endangered. This is where they live. It's on fire. Let's put out the fire. But nope, turns out they need those fires. Nature needs to do its thing. So any questions about that example? All right, the next word for attendance won't be a word again, just sort of like the last one. Pick one dish that your family always has for Thanksgiving that you don't like. Or maybe if you're lucky enough, maybe you do like everything that your family makes. So then come up with some other maybe traditional Thanksgiving dish that you don't like. And if you like it all, that's a sufficient answer too. You could say, I have no answer for this because I love everything. Anyway, really quickly before we leave for the week, let's talk about sustainable resource management. This is what I've already been hinting at when I talked about like fishing license and your, what do they call them, deer tags in West Virginia? Like you're not deer tags? Yeah. So here it is. Like this is what they're trying to shoot for. Actually, let's go back to the fishing example. And I'm not talking about me going to the Cranberry River, trying to catch some trout. I'm talking about like commercial fishing, like Deadliest Catch, crabbing. I don't know if you've seen that, but anyway, according to the logistic growth model, the fastest growth occurs when a population is at 1/2 its carrying capacity. Let me try to recreate this graph that you've seen so many times today. This is logistic growth, right? It starts off big and then it evens out, right? Oh, that's so horrible. So here is carrying capacity, right? When it hits 0. This is the sweet spot. Halfway between 0 and carrying capacity. This is when the population is growing the fastest. So theoretically, best results are achieved by harvesting the population down to this level. And this is why we need population ecology. Someone has to figure out the carrying capacity of a particular population. And then they have to figure out the size of that particular population, right? So they know how close they are to getting to carrying capacity. And they have to try to get the population at that sweet spot. So they have to know all the limiting factors, right? They need to know the life history. They need to know all these things to help get to that sweet spot. And it's a sweet spot because that's when the population is growing the quickest. And it's not even near carrying capacity, right? So when it's growing the quickest, you're harvesting a lot, right? So if you harvest more than you should, right, then they start getting towards the carrying capacity, right? So they don't reproduce as quick. So that's not good. And of course, if you harvest fewer than you could, then the population, again, it's not growing as quick. So, and obviously you're catching fewer fish, and your goal is to catch fish, so you don't want that, right? So that's the sweet spot. However, the logistics model assumes that the growth rate and carrying capacity are stable over time, again, because these are just models, but this changes, right? So we might know the carrying capacity of trout in the Cranberry River, for example, for 2024, but things are going to change, right? Little things change, and then therefore the carrying capacity would also change. If there's fewer resources or more resources, or for some reason the population exploded, or for some reason the population collapsed. Right? If you download the PowerPoint, you can click this link and watch a little video about this. Again, I've already given this example. Fish, which are the only wild animals still hunted at large scale. And I know that might sound weird because like, oh, it's called fishing, not hunting. But in theory, it's still hunting. You're going after an animal to kill it. But they're very vulnerable to overharvesting. And the old textbook gave an actual example of the North Atlantic cod fishery. I can't explain it in a day, or excuse me, yeah, so that's it. I guess the last word for attendance will be, once again, you come up with the word, what do you want for dessert for Thanksgiving? That's the last word for attendance, and that's it. I will be in office hours, like I said, I will be working this week, so if you need me, please let me help you. Some of you really need to get caught up, but let me help you. And that's it. Guys, have a good week.